For a game that brands itself as the real driving simulator, Gran Turismo excels at creating fun yet realistic races. However, there have been a few races over the years that stand out for being bizarre, weird and unnecessarily challenging. In today's video we'll take a look at some of these races and we'll see what makes them so memorable. And we'll gradually get more unique as we progress through the video. Remember to check out the Patreon and the Discord, and let's get into it. So the first race that we'll talk about is the Polyphony Digital Cup. So many of you who keep up with the current trend of older Gran Turismo playthroughs may have seen or heard about the Polyphony Digital Cup, particularly in the later stages of the games. These races are interesting because to my knowledge they're the only race series in the game where you're not allowed to upgrade your car. And this is fascinating because from your very first race you're encouraged to upgrade your car, and the increasing quality of prize cars kind of reinforces this progression. So just getting in the end of your playthrough and then be told you can't have upgrades is a bit of a shock, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. After driving some of the fastest race cars in the game, you might actually welcome the chance to switch back to a normal production car, for example. And the opponents themselves aren't even upgraded, so it's safe to say it's a more relaxing race than what you have indeed. But this idea started in Gran Turismo 3 where you had to use production cars, but you could put on any upgrades you want. Race returned in Gran Turismo 4, the same general concept, although the grid was somewhat messed up. I'll talk about this a little bit later. It returned in Gran Turismo 5 when the grid was fixed, and then by the time Gran Turismo 6 came around you had to use road cars, but this time you couldn't even upgrade them. So you had to use a car that was completely stock. Makes this race stand as in most of the series you can pick a car, max that car out, and then complete most of the campaign without a single car. But this strategy doesn't work here, so you're going to have to use a completely different car for this race, making this race somewhat more challenging to complete, and the races will also reward you some pretty nice prize cars. In fact, some of the prizes here are considerably better than the card you actually used to win the race, which is a rarity in the Gran Turismo series. In Gran Turismo 3 you had a chance to win the Suzuki Escudo, an F1 car, the Toyota GT1 or the TVR Speed 12. 4 fantastic cars on offer there. And in Gran Turismo 5 B-Spec you were able to win the R34 Skyline, just to name a few. But I mentioned earlier about the grid in Gran Turismo 4 that I said was a bit messed up. So what I find funny is the variety of AI cars that can appear in these races, in Gran Turismo 4 specifically. So in GT4, the lower tier of the grid is reserved for kind of slow hatchbacks, like this Alfa Romeo you see on the screen, Audi S2, this old 100 horsepower Peugeot, those sort of things. Then you have a Japanese sports car thrown in, like the Toyota Supra, Mazda RX-7 or Mitsubishi Evo. But occasionally they throw in a more challenging opponent, like the Lotus Esprit V8, this 500 horsepower Mercedes, or a Ford GT with 550 horsepower. And then somewhere in the mix there can also be an old 1960s muscle car. Now I'm sure this has to be one of the most bizarre lineups of cars in any Gran Turismo race in the series. Okay, the next race we'll talk about is the Like the Wind event. So this is another classic from the older Gran Turismo games, and as the name suggests is reserved for the fastest cars in the game. And it's often the final race players complete and arguably one of the most difficult. So the concept is simple: race the fastest cars on a very straight track. It's all about raw power and speed, so you'll need a car that really packs a punch to keep up here. So this event first appeared in Gran Turismo 2 under the name Mega Speed Cup, but it returned in Gran Turismo 3 as Like the Wind, and it has remained under this name ever since. But in Gran Turismo 3, despite the AI cars having a lot of horsepower, Polyphony forgot to tune the gearboxes accordingly, and these cars are actually no faster than if they didn't have any upgrades on. So it may seem like this race isn't too much of a challenge. Well, that changed in Gran Turismo 4 when the AI cars were upgraded to around 900 horsepower, making the race far more competitive. And in Gran Turismo 5 and Gran Turismo 6, the size of the grid expanded, so instead of just 6 cars, the race now features up to 20 cars. Many of these with over 1000 horsepower, and the speeds in this event can reach up to 270 miles an hour. So to really have a chance here, you need to have a car capable of hitting at least 300 miles an hour to comfortably win. What makes this more interesting is that at the start you won't have access to the fastest cars in the game stock, so you'll need to heavily tune a road car to stay competitive, and this can make for some very interesting builds as seen online. But let me know how you completed this race. Now moving on to the VITS race, or the Garrus race. Now of course it wouldn't be a Gran Turismo video without mentioning the VITs.
Close to 9. And this car. What is it? Ew. It's pink.
So the VIT, or the Yaris series, is one of the most recognisable races or race series from Gran Turismo 3, being included in both the Beginner League and the Professional League. So essentially it's just a championship reserved for only the Toyota Yaris or the VITs, depending on which version of the game you got. The Beginner League races are fine. You have to use a Yaris, which you probably have about 3 of them by now, let's be honest. But if somehow you don't have them, they can be bought cheaply for around 20,000 credits. You'll need a few upgrades to win, but nothing special. And then you have the Championship, which is 5 2-lap long races. You get some nice prize money for winning, although the reward isn't very great, being yet another Yaris. I've spoken about the redundancy in some of these prize cars before, so I won't go over that. But it is a nice entry into the world of manufactured races in the game though, preparing you for what's to come later. However, the professional version, that's a completely different story. Just when you thought you'd left the slow hatchbacks behind, you now have to get in one again in the Yaris Championship. This time you'll have to nearly max it out just to be competitive, and be prepared to sit there for a while as these races are 10 laps long. Yes, that's 10 laps around the test course in a Yaris, taking up to half an hour. And that's just one of the races in the championship. So the prize money is terrible for the time consumed, so let's hope that the prize cars make up for this barrel of disappointment. Well, you are in luck, because for the most part they do. You have a 50% chance to win either the Tom Supra or the Altezza touring car. Both of these are good race cars with lots of use, but by this point you've probably completed most of the game already, so their use will be limited. If you get slightly more unlucky, you'll just get a normal Toyota Supra. Once again, not a bad car, but nothing special, especially at kind of this late stage of the game. However, if you get really unlucky, yeah, you can see why this championship is so hated amongst the GT community. Now we'll move on to the Peugeot 206 Cup in Gran Turismo 4. We'll talk about the Yaris race and why it's so bad, and while we've established it's difficult with your patience providing a better challenge in the race itself, there have been more difficult races from the past. A notable one is this Peugeot race from Gran Turismo 4. So each manufacturer kind of had a unique race to them, and some of these were very easy, rewarding very generous prize cards, and some of these were more difficult for unknown reasons. So the Peugeots that you'll compete against have a ridiculous amount of power and even come equipped with racing hard tyres. You'll need to spend several times what the car is worth just on upgrades to win. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't think this race is actually too bad. Races are a lot shorter, being around 3 to 4 laps rather than the 10 laps that was the Yaris races. And there's only about 3 races rather than like the 5 or 7 in the Yaris Cup. They're significantly shorter. And you can actually cheese it with the 206 rally car if you have it. And on top of this you get the Peugeot 205 rally car from 1985 as a prize, a fantastic car. And that's one of the best rally cars in the game. So overall I do think it's a good trade. But there is one race that stands out in the community that is the hardest manufacturer race. And that is the Opel Speedster Cup. Many of you probably know about this race, but if you don't, I'll tell you a little bit about it. So the Opel Speedster is the exact same as the Vauxhall VX620, just depending on where the car was sold. And this was voted as the hardest manufacturer race in the series for a good reason. So the Peugeot 206 Cup and the VIT race have heavily modified versions of the original cars, but at least they're still beatable. For this race, the AI will be faster than what you can actually tune your car to be. So no matter what upgrades you have, you'll always be slower. And since the AI come equipped with racing soft tyres, they'll probably be faster than you around the corners as well. On top of this, there's no way to cheese the event as the Opel Speedster doesn't have a rally or touring car variant, so you are literally stuck using the original car trying to beat impossible AI. But don't worry about it, the GT Wiki has written a whole strategy guide dedicated to just this one race series. And it's so extreme that they actually recommend buying the naturally aspirated version for a better power band, a 30 kg of ballast at the rear of the car to improve acceleration, and buying nitrous. But if you don't go to these extreme lengths, the chance of you winning a championship is very low. But what happens if you do win it? Well, you get 7,500 credits. However, you do win the Vauxhall Calibra touring car, one of the highest revving cars in the Gran Turismo series. So make of that what you will. We've talked about the hardest manufactured races in the series, but what about the weirdest? Well, to my knowledge, this is it, the Suzuki Concept race. So we'll take two random, unbalanced concept cars, put them head to head, turning up the difficulty, and making one car almost impossible to beat. But what actually is the race? So I mentioned it a little while ago that it's a race for Suzuki Concepts. Quite an unusual niche, I know, but this is what Polyphony went with. And the race is limited to just two cars, the Suzuki Swift Concept and the Suzuki GSX Concept. But the GSX is significantly better than the Swift, so you should just use the GSX then. Well no, the GSX is only obtainable by winning the event. Meaning that you are forced to use the Suzuki Swift Concept. Not a bad car with a surprising amount of horsepower, but definitely not an ideal car to choose for racing. The power to weight difference between these two cars makes this race especially tough. The Suzuki GSX actually has less power somehow, but it is lighter, nearly 500 kilograms, and set up much better for racing. This means that it's way faster than the Swift. But to win the Suzuki Swift, you will need to win the Suzuki K-Car Challenge. So to enter this event, you will have to do some other race first, meaning it is kind of a locked event. But if you do manage to win, the prize is actually pretty good. I mentioned earlier the Suzuki GSX itself. So if you do want to complete the race again, it should be straightforward. But now we'll move on to some of the driving missions, one driving mission specifically. Now this one is driving mission 34, or the Mercedes at the Nürburgring. So many of you will know this mission for requiring you to wait over a minute watching the other cars drive past before you can even begin racing. Which is pretty funny at first, but once you fail multiple times it can quickly become frustrating and boring. It's also quite difficult, so they line up a series of Mercedes cars ascending in power, giving each one a head start, and there's one lap around Nürburgring, and your job is simply overtake them and, like I said, do a full lap and beat them basically. However, the track is so narrow that this does become quite challenging, and you'll likely find yourself retrying many times. This mission has turned into somewhat of a meme in the Gran Turismo community, and it's safe to say it's arguably one of the most difficult driving missions in the entire series. Saying things like how it took them over 100 tries just to beat one of them. So this was a hidden event in Gran Turismo 5 that was unlocked from getting to level 30 in A spec or B spec. And a kind of a limited time mode, if you will, although it's permanent, so I'm not really too sure. But there's one around the Nürburgring, the shorter track, one event around Monza, and one about Suzuka. All of these are really difficult, but generally the Nürburgring is the easiest, Monza's, obviously very difficult, and Suzuka seems to be the hardest one from what I've seen. So you have to drive a Red Bull, the fastest Red Bull, around Suzuka from the pit stop 2 laps in a time of 2 minutes 10 seconds to get gold. That means you have to nail every single corner for 2 laps with no mistakes. However, you get 564,000 credits for gold, and you get the Red Bull, and you get a choice of, if you get all gold in all of them, you get 3 different Red Bull cars. So it is definitely worth it, but I must warn you, it is very, very difficult. And I think this takes the spot for the hardest race in Gran Turismo, in my opinion. We've established some of the weirdest races in the Suzuki Concept Car Cup, some of the most boring and frustrating races with the Vitz Cup, Some of the hardest manufactured races with the Opel Cup, and the hardest event in Gran Turismo with the Sebastian Vettel Challenge. Let me know what you think about these races, or if you have any other races that you think are harder or weirder. And I'll see you in the next video. Like and subscribe. Goodbye.